The lights blazed hot over the stage, cameras locked in, and the nation's eyes were already glued to the broadcast when the moment hit like a sucker punch. Barron Trump leaned forward, his tone sharp and deliberate, and spat the words meant to wound. "She's unfit." The insult sliced through the air like a blade. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. The audience shifted uneasily, a low murmur rippling across the room. Some gasped. Others smirked. And millions at home clutched their phones, thumbs already flying across screens. In seconds, hashtags erupted. #Unfit lit up Twitter like a wildfire, climbing the charts faster than breaking news alerts. Clips of the insult were already looping on TikTok, commentators rushing to frame the narrative, a powerful name cutting down a rising star. The arrogance was undeniable, the dismissal total. But Crockett did not flinch. She let the silence hang heavy, so heavy it almost cracked. The pause stretched until the room itself seemed to lean in. Barron smirked, convinced he'd landed the killing blow. And then, just the faintest shift in Jasmine's expression, a spark in her eyes that suggested she wasn't broken. She was calculating. Viewers leaned forward, sensing it. The tension was unbearable. CNN's camera zoomed closer, capturing the faint curve of a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't defeat, it was the patience of someone holding a card no one expected. And in that moment, Crockett reached for something on the desk before her. Papers shuffled. A phone screen glowed. The energy shifted, like the air just before a thunderstorm. What was she about to do? Was this hesitation, or preparation? Social media detonated again. She's about to clap back. Watch this. Crockett ain't done. The comments flooded faster than moderators could keep up. Even the moderators on stage seemed caught, their eyes darting between them, sensing history in the making. And then came the tease of what was about to unravel. Because what Jasmine Crockett pulled out wasn't just a counterpoint, not just a comeback, it was something far more devastating. It was a recording. A recording that would flip the entire debate upside down. The room buzzed like an electrical wire about to snap. The insult still hung in the air, echoing across the studio, but it was no longer the insult itself that gripped the audience, it was the silence that followed. Jasmine Crockett's fingers hovered above her phone, steady, deliberate, as if she knew the weight of the moment belonged entirely to her now. Barron Trump leaned back in his chair, smugness plastered across his face, confident that he had reduced his opponent to nothing more than a headline casualty. Unfit, one word, one strike, designed to dismiss not just her but the generations of sacrifice and struggle she represented. It wasn't just personal, it was political theater meant to remind America who he thought still held the power. And yet, even as the insult replayed on endless loops across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, something else was happening. The nation wasn't rallying to Barron's confidence, it was waiting. Waiting for Jasmine's response. Waiting for that spark they had seen in her eyes, that silent defiance building into something more. Producers in the control room whispered urgently, trying to predict the next beat. Should they cut to commercial? Stay live? Every instinct said this was the moment, the kind that defines careers, shifts narratives, and cements reputations. And so they stayed. Meanwhile, across the country, living rooms lit up with debate. Some shook their heads, muttering about arrogance. Others leaned forward, sensing that Crockett wasn't out, she was winding up. That's what made the insult so dangerous. It wasn't just a jab, it was a gauntlet thrown, daring her to rise, or crumble, in front of the entire nation. And Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman who crumbled. Her silence was not weakness. It was strategy. She let the word unfit reverberate, let it echo long enough that America could hear not just the insult, but the centuries-old undertones behind it. Women dismissed. People of color silenced. Immigrants told they didn't belong. All of it, distilled into one word meant to shut her down. But Jasmine was not just defending herself, she was standing in for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. That's why this moment mattered. That's why the stakes towered higher than the stage lights above them. Because if she faltered, the insult would stick. And if she answered, it could change everything. The chatter on social media grew louder. Memes appeared within minutes, split screenshots of Barron sneering and Jasmine biding her time. Hashtags multiplied, hashtag watch her cook, hashtag unfit or unstoppable, hashtag Crockett versus Trump. The internet didn't just want a clapback. It demanded one. And then came the whisper of something bigger. People started speculating. Does she have receipts? Is she about to expose something? The tension spread like wildfire because Jasmine had built a reputation, not for being loud, not for being reckless, but for being prepared. For coming armed with more than opinions. For coming armed with proof. That was when it became clear, this was no longer just a clash of egos. It was a test of truth versus power, of evidence versus arrogance. The nation wasn't just watching a debate anymore. They were watching a duel where the outcome could reshape how Americans saw not only Crockett, but themselves. The silence couldn't last forever. Jasmine's hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward the phone that glowed on the desk. The air thickened. The audience leaned forward. Barron smirked wider, convinced she was stalling. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stalling. She was about to raise the stakes to a level no one in that room, or across America, was ready for. Barron Trump wasn't supposed to be the villain in this story. At least, not in his own mind. From the moment he stepped onto that stage, he carried himself like someone who had inherited not just wealth, but the presumption of authority. Every tilt of his chin, every condescending glance, broadcasted a single message. I belong here. She doesn't. For years, the Trump name had been synonymous with power, headlines, and controversy. And Barron, the youngest heir to that legacy, had grown up in a world where cameras followed his every move, where bodyguards carved a path before he even had to step forward. Unlike Jasmine Crockett, who had scraped her way through doubt and dismissal, Barron had never known the sting of being underestimated. If anything, he had lived in the comfort of overestimation. Doors opened for him before he'd even knocked. When he called Jasmine unfit, it wasn't just a word tossed carelessly into the air. It was the culmination of that upbringing, the reflex of someone who had been told his voice carried more weight than anyone else's. To Barron, politics wasn't about service. It was about dominance, about proving that the Trump dynasty still had the power to command rooms and silence opponents. But beneath that polished arrogance lurked cracks that Jasmine Crockett knew how to find. Because Barron, for all his bravado, carried contradictions that the public had started to notice. He positioned himself as a champion of American grit, yet he had never truly faced struggle. He railed about sacrifice and patriotism, yet his own path had been cushioned by privilege. He mocked others as unfit, but what had he ever endured to prove himself fit? This was the irony Jasmine's supporters seized on almost instantly. Social media filled with biting posts. Unfit? Says the guy who never had to pay a bill. Others chimed in. Imagine growing up in a penthouse and calling someone who clawed her way to Congress unfit. The hypocrisy was obvious to anyone paying attention. Still, Barron's confidence on stage wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. He knew that an insult, well-placed and confidently delivered, could wound more deeply than any fact sheet or statistic. His father had built a career on that very tactic, branding opponents with a single word, turning them into caricatures in the public eye. And here, on live TV, Barron was trying to replicate that playbook. One word, one label, one dismissal. But what Barron underestimated was the power of context. When Donald Trump had coined nicknames and flung insults, the tactic worked because of timing, spectacle, and his ability to command a stage. Barron, however, was no longer playing on a field where his family's name alone could guarantee victory. The nation had seen too much, learned too much. America had grown weary of arrogance without substance. And this was where his contradictions became fatal. Because while Barron tried to frame Jasmine as inexperienced and unfit, the truth was that his own resume lacked the very grit he claimed to value. He hadn't stood in courtrooms. He hadn't battled in legislative chambers. He hadn't walked door to door, fighting for votes. His authority was inherited, not earned. And that contrast, between a woman who had carved her own place and a man who had his handed to him, was about to explode under the studio lights. The audience sensed it. The smugness in Barron's expression wasn't landing the way he thought it was. Instead of intimidating, it revealed entitlement. Instead of silencing Jasmine, it fueled anticipation for what she might unleash in response. Viewers online compared his demeanor to a kid playing king in a borrowed crown. Others called him a mirror of his father's worst habits, minus the charisma. But the most dangerous thing for Barron wasn't the criticism, it was Jasmine's silence. Because silence in politics is rarely empty. Silence builds pressure, and when it finally breaks, it can topple even the most confident opponent. The irony was thick. Barron had meant to humiliate Jasmine, to box her in with one dismissive phrase. Instead, he had boxed himself in, drawing all attention to whether he could stand up to the truth once it was unleashed. His downfall wasn't in the insult itself, it was in the arrogance that made him believe it would stick. By the time the cameras zoomed in again, the narrative was already shifting. Barron Trump wasn't being seen as the heir apparent stepping confidently into the political arena. He was being seen as a bully repeating old family tricks, trying to wield inherited arrogance against earned dignity. And the nation was beginning to hunger, not for his dominance, but for his undoing. And Jasmine Crockett was the one holding the match. Jasmine Crockett never walked into a room expecting privilege to carry her. She walked in expecting to prove herself, again and again. And for much of her life, that was the only option she had. Born far from the corridors of wealth and influence, Jasmine's story began in neighborhoods where resilience wasn't an abstract virtue, it was survival. She grew up watching her family stretch paychecks to cover rent, seeing her community overlooked by those in power, and understanding early that dignity was something you defended, not something anyone handed to you. While Barron Trump's childhood was cocooned in gold-plated elevators and marble lobbies, Jasmine's was built on long days, hard work, and the relentless drive to make something of herself despite the odds. She wasn't supposed to rise. The system wasn't designed for people like her to take up space in Washington. But Jasmine had fire, and that fire drove her into law, where she first made her mark not by defending the wealthy, but by standing up for the voiceless. She took cases others wouldn't touch, representing those who had been dismissed, ignored, or written off. In courtrooms, she sharpened her instincts like steel against stone, learning that words weren't just arguments, they were weapons, lifelines, shields for those who had nothing else. But being a lawyer wasn't the endgame. It was the training ground. Jasmine knew that the fight for justice couldn't just happen in court, it had to happen in the halls of power. That's what led her to politics, despite the whispers, the smirks, and the doubters. She doesn't belong, they'd say. She's too raw, too direct, too unpolished. But those were the same criticisms that revealed her strength. Jasmine Crockett was authentic. She was sharp. And she was fearless. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was gritty. Campaigning meant knocking on doors until her knuckles ached, listening to stories of single mothers juggling 3 jobs, veterans denied proper care, immigrants terrified of losing their homes. Every handshake was a promise. Every late-night strategy session was a gamble. Every dollar raised was a testament to belief in her vision. When she finally won her seat in Congress, it wasn't because she was expected to. It was because she made herself undeniable. In Washington, Jasmine didn't fade into the background. She didn't bow her head or soften her voice. Instead, she became known for her sharp wit, her pointed questions, and her refusal to let arrogance or bigotry go unchallenged. Colleagues quickly learned that underestimating her was a mistake. Reporters began calling her the freshman who fights back. And constituents saw in her not just a representative, but a reflection of themselves. The grit, the hustle, the quiet strength of communities that had been overlooked for too long. That's what made her so dangerous to someone like Barron Trump. He thrived on opponents who folded under pressure, who let the weight of a name or a legacy silence them. Jasmine was the opposite. Every dismissal only sharpened her resolve. Every insult was an opportunity to expose hypocrisy. and every attempt to box her in only revealed how deeply she understood the power of standing her ground. Her supporters knew this. To them, Jasmine wasn't just another politician. She was proof. Proof that someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and lived their struggles could rise and hold her own in the most hostile arenas. She carried with her the pride of first-generation college students, the hope of immigrant families, the determination of women who had been told no too many times. It was this history, this reservoir of resilience, that made her response to Barron Trump so much more than just another debate moment. When he called her unfit, it didn't just land as an insult, it echoed every time she had been underestimated, every time someone had tried to tell her she didn't belong. And rather than shrinking from it, she did what she had always done. She prepared, she fought, and she turned the attack into her advantage. Because here's the truth Jasmine understood better than anyone. Arrogance may win attention, but authenticity wins hearts. And when the two collide on live television, arrogance doesn't stand a chance. As she stood on that stage, expression steady, eyes locked, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett facing off against Barron Trump. It was the years of grinding work, of being doubted, of refusing to back down. It was every courtroom case, every campaign step, every voice she had carried with her from her community to Congress. And all those years of grit and preparation were about to explode in one unforgettable moment. The stage lights burned brighter as the tension between Jasmine Crockett and Barron Trump began to thicken. It was no longer just a debate, it was a duel, one where every pause, every glance, every raised eyebrow carried the weight of millions watching. Barron leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Congresswoman Crockett, people like you simply don't have the experience, the poise, or frankly the fitness to lead in matters of national importance." His words were meant to sting, but more than that, they were meant to rattle. His tone carried the arrogance of someone who had grown up unchallenged, used to the room bending in his favor. The audience shifted uncomfortably. A few murmurs echoed through the hall. Cameras zoomed in, catching Jasmine's calm, unwavering face. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. Instead, she allowed the silence to hang, suffocating in its weight. Then, with a subtle smile, she replied, "It's funny you mention fitness, Barron. Because the only test I see being failed here tonight is the one where arrogance tries to pass as wisdom." Gasps erupted. The crowd wasn't expecting it. Such precision, such coolness. Barron blinked, caught off guard, but quickly forced a smirk, pretending her words hadn't cut. "Cute line," he scoffed, "but we're not here for stand-up comedy." Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone sharpening. "No, we're here for truth. And truth doesn't bow to privilege, no matter how loudly it speaks." The audience clapped, hesitant at first, then stronger. Barron's expression tightened. He tried to interrupt, but Jasmine held her ground, her cadence controlled and unshaken. "You've had the luxury," she continued, "of mistaking your family's name for credentials. I've had the burden, and the privilege, of building mine on service. That's the difference between us." The hall buzzed. Phones came out, recording. Twitter feeds lit up in real time. Every word felt heavier, sharper, more cinematic than the last. Barron shifted again, his confidence beginning to crack. For the first time, he looked unsettled, his rehearsed grin faltering as he scrambled to regain footing. "Service," he shot back, his tone rising. "Spare us the sob story. America needs results, not excuses." And there it was, the slip. His voice strained, defensive, almost desperate. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Jasmine's composure against Barron's unraveling facade. Jasmine let him finish, then tilted her head ever so slightly, her voice low but piercing. "The only excuse here, Barron, is the one you make every time you hide behind your last name." The audience erupted, laughter, applause, even a few cheers. The moderators glanced at one another, knowing they had lost control of the room. Barron's jaw tightened, his rehearsed swagger slipping into irritation. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She stayed measured, her words deliberate. That was her strength. She wasn't here to trade petty barbs, she was here to expose. And with every exchange, She was pulling him deeper into his own contradictions. The duel escalated, volleys of words colliding, but only one side remained steady. The crowd sensed it. The viewers at home sensed it. Barron's smirk had transformed into a scowl, while Jasmine's calm resolve only grew sharper. It was no longer just about who could speak louder. It was about who could stand taller under pressure. And in that moment, the answer was undeniable. But just when it seemed Patel, no Barron Trump, might recover, just when his voice steadied and he prepared to pivot back into confidence, Jasmine Crockett delivered the comeback of the decade. The silence before Jasmine spoke again was almost theatrical, drawn out just long enough for the audience, and the millions watching at home, to lean in. Barron Trump straightened in his chair, visibly trying to reclaim his poise. He forced a grin, as if to suggest he had weathered the storm. But Jasmine Crockett was just beginning. She glanced toward the moderator, then back at Barron, her eyes steady, her tone deliberate. "Since you're so concerned about fitness, Barron, maybe the American people deserve to hear something you'd rather they didn't." The air shifted. Phones lifted higher, red recording dots blinking like constellations in the crowd. Even Barron's smirk faltered, just for a second. Jasmine reached into her folder. The sound of the paper sliding out seemed louder than it should have been, amplified by the tense quiet. Then she paused, letting the anticipation thrum like a heartbeat. She held up a small recording device. "You see," she said evenly, "I don't deal in insults. I deal in receipts." The crowd gasped, a ripple spreading through the audience like a wave crashing against the shore. Barron tried to interject, "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous." But Jasmine lifted a hand, silencing him with nothing but composure. She pressed play. Barron's own voice filled the auditorium. Not the polished, camera-ready tone he had used tonight. No, this was raw, unfiltered. The recording revealed him in a closed-door meeting, dismissing military families as overrated sob stories, and mocking community organizers as people who couldn't cut it anywhere else. The room exploded. Gasps. Shouts. A woman in the back covered her mouth, stunned. The moderators leaned forward, eyes wide. Barron's face drained of color. He tried to laugh it off, shaking his head, but the recording continued, every word slicing deeper into the image he had tried to project. "And if they can't handle the truth," his recorded voice sneered, "they're unfit to lead, unfit to matter, unfit to even be heard." Jasmine let the words echo, then clicked the device off. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned forward and said, with a quiet strength that carried across every microphone, "You called me unfit. But tonight, the American people just heard what unfitness really sounds like." The audience erupted, this time not in gasps, but in thunderous applause. People rose from their seats. Some shouted, "Yes." Others shook their heads in disbelief at the sheer boldness of it all. The energy was electric, as though the room itself had been jolted awake. Barron scrambled, his voice cracking. "That's out of context. That's..." But the damage was already done. The crowd wasn't buying it. The cameras weren't buying it. Twitter wasn't buying it. Already, hashtags were forming online. Hashtag unfit exposed. Hashtag Crockett receipts. Hashtag mic drop moment. Jasmine sat back, calm, almost serene. The contrast was cinematic. Barron flailing, his confidence crumbling, while she radiated the very poise and dignity he claimed she lacked. One of the moderators tried to restore order. "Congresswoman Crockett, that's certainly unexpected. Do you wish to comment further?" She nodded once, firmly. "Only this, leadership is not inherited. It's earned. And when you mock service, when you belittle sacrifice, when you call people unfit because you don't understand their struggle, that tells us everything we need to know about who you are. And about who you'll never be." The crowd roared again. Even those who had been hesitant earlier were now on their feet, swept up in the force of her words. Barron shook his head, muttering into the microphone, "This is fake, this is doctored," but his voice was drowned out by applause. The camera zoomed in, his eyes darting, his jaw tight, his carefully rehearsed confidence shattered. It was the kind of moment that transcended politics. It was cinematic, unforgettable, the instant where the villain is caught in their own web, and the hero rises not with brute force, but with undeniable truth. Jasmine didn't need to say more. She simply let the room react, let the weight of Barron's own words crush him. Her restraint made the moment even more devastating. She had delivered the comeback of the decade, and she knew it. And as the crowd finally began to settle, as the moderators scrambled to move the debate forward, the world beyond that room was already igniting. Clips were being shared at lightning speed. Commentators were drafting their takes. Memes were flooding feeds. But in that charged, unforgettable moment, one truth stood above the noise. Jasmine Crockett had taken the insult meant to diminish her, and turned it into the weapon that exposed him. And as the clips spread like wildfire, the real shockwaves were just beginning. The debate ended, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes of Jasmine pressing stop on that recording, the digital world detonated. Phones buzzed with notifications, timelines lit up, and the clip of Barron's unraveling spread like a virus set loose on the bloodstream of American politics. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all carried the same 37-second video that replayed on an endless loop. Barron leaning back, smug, dismissing her as unfit, followed by the cold replay of his own words mocking military families and community leaders. By the time the broadcast signed off, hashtags had climbed into the stratosphere. Hashtag unfit exposed, hashtag Crockett versus Trump, hashtag mic drop moment. Late night shows seized it instantly. One host replayed the moment with slow motion effects, then mimicked Barron's stunned face while the audience howled. Another joked, usually, debates end with handshakes, this one ended with a political obituary. Memes flooded feeds. Barron's smirk captioned with, confidence before the storm, next to Jasmine's calm expression captioned, the storm itself. News anchors, desperate to ride the wave, cut in with breaking news banners even though the footage was already viral. Pundits who just hours earlier dismissed Crockett as a long shot were now scrambling to revise their takes. She demonstrated command, one analyst admitted. She didn't just survive the attack, she turned it into a national indictment of entitlement and arrogance. Supporters flooded the streets outside campaign offices, waving signs that were scrawled with Crockett's words from the debate, "Leadership is not inherited. It's earned." For many, it became more than a clapback, it was a rallying cry. Meanwhile, critics scrambled for damage control. Surrogates claimed the recording was manipulated, that the audio was taken out of context. But the denials only fueled the fire. Fact-checkers moved quickly, confirming its authenticity, and within hours, news tickers read, recording verified, no evidence of alteration. The ripple effects spread beyond politics. Veterans groups issued statements condemning Barron's words, praising Crockett for exposing them. College students circulated the clip with captions like, "This is why debates matter." Even celebrities weighed in. One A-list actor tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave us the political equivalent of a knockout punch." In living rooms and coffee shops, the debate replayed like a movie climax. People reenacted Jasmine's calm delivery, mimicking the pause before she hit play on the recording. Parents told their kids, "This is what standing your ground looks like." For Barron, the fallout was brutal. Headlines the next morning read, Barron Trump left reeling after viral debate disaster, Crockett's recording rocks campaign, and, from smirk to silence, the 37 seconds that changed everything. Editorial cartoons showed him tangled in cassette tape, silenced by his own words. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a transformation. Overnight, she went from underestimated to unstoppable. Her social media followers doubled. Donations poured into her campaign. She wasn't just a politician anymore, she was a symbol. A fighter who carried not just her own story, but the stories of countless others dismissed, diminished, or deemed unfit. And yet, beneath the noise and the memes, something deeper was taking shape. Commentators began to frame the moment not just as political theater, but as a cultural turning point. One op-ed put it bluntly, Crockett versus Trump wasn't about two individuals. It was about two visions of America. One clings to entitlement. The other insists on dignity. The stage had become more than a platform. It had become a mirror. And in that mirror, millions of Americans saw themselves reflected in Jasmine's calm defiance. But as the nation buzzed with laughter, disbelief, and praise, a more profound question lingered in the air. What does this moment mean for America's future? Because while the hashtags trended and the applause echoed, the true weight of her comeback was not yet measured. The answer would come in the days ahead. And beneath all the chaos, one thing was clear: Jasmine Crockett had changed the game. But beneath the noise, a deeper lesson was taking shape. As the dust began to settle, the world started asking not just what happened on that debate stage, but why it mattered so much. And the answer was more profound than a viral clip or a clever clapback. For generations, America has been told that power comes from pedigree, last names, inherited fortunes, the right circles of influence. But Jasmine Crockett shattered that myth in one breathtaking moment. She reminded the nation that leadership is not passed down like an heirloom. It is forged in the fire of service, sacrifice, and truth. Her calm, deliberate counterattack wasn't simply about silencing an insult. It was about reframing the narrative for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Immigrants who've been labeled outsiders. Women who've been told they're too emotional. Workers dismissed as unqualified by those who never worked a day outside privilege. Jasmine stood for them all. In that moment, she wasn't just defending her name, she was defending the dignity of millions. And by doing so, she turned a sneer of arrogance into a mirror America couldn't look away from. Because the insult Barron hurled at her, Unfit, wasn't about Jasmine at all. It was about every American who's ever been underestimated, ignored, or written off. And here's the truth: that's why the clip went viral. Not because it was dramatic, though it was. Not because it was shocking, though it was absolutely stunned. It resonated because it carried a universal message. Your worth is not decided by the powerful who dismiss you, it is revealed by how you rise in the face of dismissal. Commentators tried to frame it as just another debate skirmish, another viral gotcha moment. But the people watching felt something deeper. Teachers told their students about it as an example of standing tall. Parents shared it with their kids as a lesson in self-respect. Activists replayed it as proof that truth, when spoken with courage, has the power to cut through even the loudest noise. And so the moral clarity emerged. The Crockett moment wasn't about one politician winning a debate. It was about dignity triumphing over entitlement, service defeating smugness, truth exposing arrogance. That's why the clip replayed on news channels and in family living rooms alike. It wasn't just entertaining, it was validating. It said to the kid working 2 jobs to pay for college, to the mother juggling work and childcare, to the immigrant father starting over with nothing: you are not unfit. You are America's backbone. And perhaps the most powerful part? Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't trade insult for insult. She simply held up a mirror. She showed that real strength doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand firm. The lesson was unmistakable. In a world where arrogance often passes for confidence, true leadership is quiet, steady, and rooted in respect. But this was not just the end of a debate, it was the beginning of something larger. Because when millions of people see themselves in a single moment, movements are born. And Jasmine's response planted a seed that politics doesn't have to be about dynasties and entitlement. It can be about ordinary people rising, speaking truth, and demanding their rightful place at the table. The audience knew it. The nation felt it. And the echo of that night would not fade quickly. Because while insults may trend for a moment, dignity echoes far longer. And Jasmine Crockett's calm, devastating response ensured that the word unfit would never again be a weapon against her, or against anyone who dares to claim their worth. But the story wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. Because with America watching, Jasmine had redefined the debate. And the question left hanging in the air was simple. If one recording could flip the narrative, what could an entire movement achieve? And so we circle back to the title moment, the insult heard around the world: she's unfit. Those words were meant to dismiss Jasmine Crockett, to box her into the corner of irrelevance. Instead, they lit the spark of one of the most unforgettable political reversals in recent memory. Because in that single exchange, Jasmine showed America what real fitness looks like. Not a last name, not inherited privilege, but courage under fire, clarity under pressure, and dignity that cannot be shaken. That's why this moment isn't just a headline, it's a lesson. A reminder that arrogance may win the microphone, but truth always wins the room. And in an age where so many feel ignored, disrespected, or written off, Jasmine stood tall for every one of them. She flipped the narrative, reclaimed the word unfit, and transformed it into a symbol of resilience and power. But here's the thing, this is bigger than one debate. It's bigger than one clash. This is about who gets to shape the future of America, those who try to gatekeep it, or those who rise to claim it. And if you've made it this far in the video, chances are you know which side you're on. That's why we created the Liberty Desk. This is where political drama meets truth, where every viral showdown becomes more than entertainment, it becomes inspiration. Backhand index pointing right. So if you believe in dignity over arrogance, service over entitlement, and truth over noise, hit that subscribe button right now. Backhand index pointing right. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not defined by the powerful, but by their own courage. Backhand index pointing right, and join us here daily, because this is just the beginning. Because when voices like Jasmine Crockett's rise, America listens. And together so will we.